The morning bell of Cedar Ridge's schoolhouse rang crisp and clear across the Colorado mountain air, its sound carrying over the wooden buildings and dusty streets of the growing mining town. 10-year-old Marcus Thompson quickened his pace, his worn leather boots crunching through the frost-covered dirt as he hurried toward the white-painted building that housed his dreams. Despite his father's best efforts with a wash basin and hard soap, Marcus's clothes still bore the telltale signs of his early morning hours at the forge. Coal dust had worked its way deep into the fibers of his shirt, and his hands, though scrubbed raw, still showed dark crescents under his fingernails. His father, Robert Thompson, was Cedar Ridge's only blacksmith, and Marcus had been his apprentice since he could safely hold a hammer. "Education is the one thing that can lift you higher than this forge, son," his father had told him countless times since his mother died 3 years ago. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Marcus believed those words with every fiber of his being. While other boys his age played marbles or practiced with slingshots, Marcus treasured his few precious books and dreamed of becoming a teacher himself someday, or perhaps even a lawyer like the ones he'd heard about in Denver. As he climbed the schoolhouse steps, Marcus could hear the chatter of the other children already inside, the Whitman family children, whose father owned the largest silver mine in the area, always arrived early in their pristine clothes and polished boots. So did the Morrison children, whose mother ran the town's most successful general store. "Look what the cat dragged in," snickered 12-year-old William Whitman as Marcus entered the classroom. "Did you fall down a chimney, Soot Boy?" Several other children giggled, but Marcus kept his head high and walked to his usual seat in the back row. He'd endured worse teasing than this, and he knew that once lessons began, his quick mind and eagerness to learn usually earned him grudging respect from his classmates. But today was different. Today, Mr. Cornelius Whitman, William's uncle and the town's new schoolmaster, stood at the front of the classroom with a stern expression that made Marcus's stomach clench with unease. Mr. Whitman had arrived from Boston just 2 weeks ago, replacing old Mr. Jenkins, who had taught with patience and kindness for nearly a decade. Where Jenkins had been encouraging and inclusive, Whitman carried himself with an air of superiority that seemed to permeate every corner of the room. "Children," Whitman announced, his nasal Boston accent cutting through the morning air. "Today, we begin implementing proper standards in this classroom. Education is a privilege reserved for those who demonstrate they are worthy of it through their appearance, their manners, and their commitment to civilized behavior." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Whitman's eyes seemed to linger on him longer than the others, taking in every coal stain and smudge with obvious disapproval. "A clean mind requires a clean body," Whitman continued, beginning to pace at the front of the room. "How can we expect to fill vessels with knowledge when those vessels are contaminated with the filth of manual labor?" The classroom had gone completely silent. Even William Whitman seemed uncomfortable with his uncle's tone. Marcus gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white with tension. "Furthermore," Whitman said, stopping directly in front of Marcus's desk, "I cannot in good conscience allow students whose presence might lower the standards of this institution or distract from the learning environment I intend to create." Marcus's heart began to pound. He could feel every pair of eyes in the classroom turning toward him, some with curiosity, others with the cruel anticipation of children who sensed trouble brewing. "Stand up, young man," Whitman ordered. Marcus rose slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor in the oppressive silence. He stood as tall as his small frame would allow, meeting Whitman's cold gaze with as much dignity as he could muster. "State your name and occupation," Whitman commanded. "Marcus Thompson, sir. I'm a student, and I help my father at his blacksmith shop." Whitman nodded as if this confirmed his worst suspicions. "As I suspected. Tell me, young Thompson, do you believe that coal dust and civilized learning can coexist in the same space? Marcus's throat felt dry, but he forced himself to speak clearly. "I believe that a person's mind matters more than the dirt on their clothes, sir." A few children gasped at Marcus's boldness. William Whitman's face reddened with embarrassment at his uncle being challenged by the soot boy. Mr. Whitman's expression hardened into something resembling granite. "I see. Well, young Thompson, I'm afraid your belief is both naive and incorrect. This classroom is for children who understand that education requires discipline, cleanliness, and respect for proper social standards." Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, though he stood perfectly still. "Sir, I work hard in my studies. I read every assignment and—" "You will gather your things," Whitman interrupted coldly, "and remove yourself from this classroom immediately. You are no longer welcome here." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Around the room, children sat in stunned silence, their mouths hanging open. Even those who had teased him seemed shocked by the harshness of Whitman's pronouncement. "Please, sir," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Learning means everything to me. I'll try harder to be clean, I promise." "The decision is final," Whitman replied with chilling finality. "Perhaps this will serve as a lesson to the other children about the importance of maintaining proper standards." With trembling hands, Marcus gathered his few books and his precious slate. His eyes burning with tears, he refused to let fall. As he walked toward the door, the silence in the classroom was deafening. Not one child spoke up for him. Not one. Teacher stood in his defense. As Marcus stepped out into the cold mountain morning, the schoolhouse door closing behind him with a decisive click, he felt something inside him break. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Education is the one thing that can lift you higher than this forge." But now it seemed even that door had been slammed shut in his face. Samuel Cross had been sitting on a wooden crate outside Hendrick's general store for the better part of an hour, appearing to anyone who glanced his way like just another drifter waiting for work. His clothes were dusty from travel, his boots worn from countless miles on horseback, and his wide-brimmed hat was pulled low over eyes that missed nothing. Most of the townsfolk who passed by barely acknowledged him. In a mining town like Cedar Ridge, strangers were common, and a man's worth was usually measured by the weight of his coin purse rather than the quality of his character. That suited Cross perfectly. He'd learned long ago that people revealed their true nature when they thought no one important was watching. He'd heard about Cedar Ridge's new schoolmaster through the network of traveling merchants and miners that crisscrossed Colorado. Word was that Cornelius Whitman had come west with grand ideas about bringing Eastern refinement to the frontier, and Cross was curious to see how such refinement would play out in a town built on the backs of hard-working miners and craftsmen. Wentas, he saw the young boy emerge from the schoolhouse with tears threatening to spill down his cheeks. Cross's attention sharpened immediately. The child, he couldn't be more than 10 or 11, walked with the careful dignity of someone trying desperately not to break down in public. His clothes were clean, but obviously mended, and yes, there were coal stains that spoke of honest work rather than laziness. Cross watched as the boy, Marcus, he'd overheard someone call him, walked slowly toward the blacksmith shop at the far end of Main Street. The child's shoulders were set with determination, but Cross could see the devastation in every line of his small body. "Shame about young Marcus," came a voice from behind him. Cross turned to see Martha Hendricks, the store owner's wife, sweeping the wooden walkway in front of her establishment. She was a kind-faced woman in her 50s, with graying hair and the practical demeanor of someone who'd spent decades dealing with frontier life. "Shame?" Cross asked mildly, adjusting his position on the crate to encourage conversation. Martha glanced around to make sure no one else was listening, then lowered her voice. "That new schoolmaster just threw him out. Poor boy's been working since dawn, helping his father, then rushing to school every day for the past 3 years. Smartest child in that classroom, if you ask me. But now he's been expelled for having..." Dirty clothes. Cross felt a familiar fire begin to burn in his chest, the same anger that had driven him for the past 15 years to use his wealth to fight exactly this kind of injustice. Expelled for dirty clothes? Mr. Whitman says Marcus is lowering the standards of the school, Martha continued, her voice heavy with disapproval. Claims children from working families distract from proper education. Half the children in this town have working parents, but Marcus's father is just the blacksmith, so he doesn't have the influence to fight back. Cross nodded thoughtfully. And this schoolmaster, he's from back east. Boston, Martha confirmed. Cornelius Whitman. He's the nephew of the mine owner, James Whitman. Came out here with fancy ideas about how frontier children should be educated. Problem is, his ideas don't seem to include children who actually work for a living. As if summoned by their conversation, the schoolhouse door opened again, and a tall, thin man in an immaculate black suit emerged. Even from a distance, Cross could see the air of superiority that seemed to radiate from Cornelius Whitman, like heat from a forge. Whitman walked toward the general store with the measured pace of a man who believed the world should adjust its rhythm to match his own. As he approached, Martha's expression tightened, but she maintained the polite facade that business required. "Good morning, Mr. Whitman," she said cordially. "Mrs. Hendricks," Whitman replied with a slight nod. His eyes flicked dismissively over Cross, clearly categorizing him as beneath notice. "I trust you heard no disturbance from the schoolhouse this morning?" Martha's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I heard you expelled young Marcus Thompson." "Ah, yes," Whitman said, as if discussing the weather. "An unfortunate but necessary action. Standards must be maintained, Mrs. Hendricks. We cannot allow the classroom environment to be contaminated by unsuitable elements." Cross felt his hands clench involuntarily, but he forced himself to remain still and silent. He'd learned that people revealed the most about themselves when they thought they were speaking to their social equals. "Marcus is a bright boy," Martha said carefully. "He's been one of our best students for years." Whitman waved a dismissive hand. "Intelligence without proper breeding and cleanliness is of little value, I'm afraid. The boy's very presence was disruptive to the other children's learning. Children from good families shouldn't have to share classroom space with laborers' children who cannot maintain basic standards of hygiene. His father is the town's blacksmith," Martha pointed out. "Marcus helps support his family through honest work." "Precisely my point," Whitman replied coldly. "The boy's place is at the forge, not in a classroom meant for children with prospects. I'm doing him a service, really, by redirecting him toward his natural station in life." Cross had heard enough. He stood slowly from his crate, his movement casual but somehow commanding attention. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Interesting philosophy, Mr. Whitman," Cross said, tipping his hat slightly. "I'm curious, what qualifications do you have for determining a child's natural station in life?" Whitman turned toward Cross with obvious irritation, clearly annoyed at being questioned by what he assumed was a common drifter. "I hardly think that's any concern of yours, Mr. Cross," Samuel replied evenly. "Samuel Cross. And you're right, it's not my concern yet. But I find myself fascinated by educational theory, particularly when it's being practiced on children." Something in Cross's tone seemed to give Whitman pause. Despite his dusty clothes, there was something about the stranger's bearing that suggested he might be more than he appeared. "Well, Mr. Cross," Whitman said, recovering his composure, "I hold a degree from Harvard University and have taught in some of Boston's finest schools. I believe that qualifies me to make judgments about educational standards." Cross nodded thoughtfully. "Harvard. Impressive. Tell me, did they teach you there that a child's capacity to learn is determined by the cleanliness of his clothes?" Whitman's face flushed slightly. They taught me that environment matters, Mr. Cross, that children learn best when surrounded by others of similar circumstances. The Thompson boy was disruptive simply by being present. I see, Cross said mildly. And the other children, the ones from similar circumstances, they're all from wealthy families, I assume. They're from families that understand the value of education and demonstrate that understanding through proper presentation and behavior. Whitman replied stiffly. Cross smiled, but there was no warmth in it. How fortunate for them, and how unfortunate for any child whose parents' occupation requires them to get their hands dirty in service to the community. Whitman seemed to realize that this conversation was not going in his favor. If you'll excuse me, I have important matters to attend to. As the schoolmaster walked away, his back rigid with offended dignity, Cross turned back to Martha, who was watching him with new interest. You're not just a drifter, are you? She asked quietly. Cross's smile became genuine for the first time. In the conversation, Mrs. Hendricks, I think it's time I paid a visit to young Marcus and his father. And perhaps after that, I'll have a conversation with the school board about educational standards. The school board is mostly made up of James Whitman's friends, Martha warned. The mine owner has a lot of influence in this town. Cross tipped his hat again and stepped down from the wooden walkway. Ma'am, I've learned that influence is often just a matter of perspective, and sometimes perspective needs adjusting. As he walked toward the blacksmith shop, Martha found herself hoping that this mysterious stranger might be exactly what Cedar Ridge needed, someone willing to stand up to the Whitmans and fight for children like Marcus Thompson. Because if someone didn't, she feared that many more good children would find themselves locked out of their own futures. The rhythmic ringing of hammer on anvil guided Samuel Cross toward the Thompson blacksmith shop, but as he drew closer, he noticed the usually steady rhythm was erratic, punctuated by long pauses that spoke of distraction and heartbreak. Through the open doors of the forge, he could see Robert Thompson standing over his anvil, but his movements lacked their usual purpose. Cross paused in the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior lit by the orange glow of the forge fire. Robert Thompson was a man in his mid-30s, with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of someone who had spent his life shaping metal through strength and skill. But today, those powerful shoulders were slumped with defeat. Marcus sat on a wooden stool in the corner, still clutching his schoolbooks despite having been expelled. The boy's eyes were red-rimmed, though he was clearly fighting to maintain his composure. Father and son shared the same stubborn set to their jaws, the same refusal to let the world see them break. Mr. Thompson, Cross called softly from the doorway. Robert looked up, startled out of his troubled thoughts. Yes? Can I help you? Cross stepped into the shop, removing his hat respectfully. My name is Samuel Cross. I'm new to town, and I was hoping you might have time to shoe my horse. He gestured toward the hitching post where his travel-worn mare waited patiently. Of course, Robert replied, though his usual enthusiasm for his craft was notably absent. Marcus, help me move the... He stopped abruptly, remembering that his son should have been in school. Cross noticed the exchange and decided to address it directly. I understand there was some trouble at the schoolhouse this morning. Robert's face hardened. Nothing that concerns you, stranger. Perhaps not, Crossy agreed. But I couldn't help noticing this young man's dedication to his books, even after what must have been a difficult morning. Marcus looked up at Cross with curiosity, surprised to be addressed with such respect by an adult he'd never met. I like to read, he said quietly, even if I can't go to school anymore. Robert's expression cracked slightly at his son's words. Marcus, why don't you go help your Aunt Sarah with the washing? Mr. Cross and I need to discuss business. Actually, Cross interjected gently. I'd prefer if Marcus stayed. I have a feeling his perspective might be valuable to our conversation. Robert frowned, clearly puzzled by this request from a customer, but Cross's tone carried an authority that made him hesitate to refuse. Tell me about what happened this morning, son, Cross said, turning to Marcus. Marcus glanced at his father, who nodded reluctantly. The boy's voice was steady, despite his obvious pain, as he recounted the morning's events. Whitman's speech about standards, the humiliating questions, and the final devastating expulsion. "And what did you say when he asked about coal dust and learning?" Cross prompted. "I said that a person's mind matters more than the dirt on their clothes," Marcus replied, lifting his chin with a flash of the defiance that had gotten him in trouble. Cross smiled for the first time since entering the shop. "Did you indeed? And how do you feel about that answer now?" Marcus considered this seriously. "I still think it's true. My clothes might be dirty, but my mind isn't. I can read better than most of the other children, and I work harder at my lessons." "Than anyone." "Marcus," Robert warned, "don't speak disrespectfully about your betters." "His betters?" Cross asked sharply. "Mr. Thompson, with respect, I've seen nothing to suggest that Mr. Whitman is this boy's better in any way that matters." Robert's face flushed. "Now, look here, Mr. Cross. I appreciate your concern, but you don't understand how things work in this town. The Whitmans own the biggest mine. They have influence, and they can make life very difficult for people like us if we don't know our place." Cross studied Robert Thompson carefully. Here was a man who had been beaten down by circumstance and social pressure, but underneath the resignation, Cross could see the same intelligence and dignity that shone so clearly in his son. "Mr. Thompson," Cross said quietly, "what if I told you that sometimes a man's place is exactly where he chooses to stand, regardless of what others think he deserves?" "I'd say that's a fine sentiment for someone who doesn't have to worry about putting food on the table," Robert replied bitterly. Cross nodded slowly. "You're right. But what if I also told you that there are ways to fight back that don't require you to risk your livelihood?" "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, his eyes bright. With sudden hope, Cross pulled out a simple wooden chair and sat down, bringing himself to eye level with the boy. "Marcus, how would you feel about attending a different school, one where your intelligence would be valued regardless of your father's profession?" Robert laughed harshly. "There is no other school. And even if there was, we couldn't afford private education." "What if cost wasn't an issue?" Cross asked. Father and son exchanged glances, both wondering if this stranger was mocking them or had simply lost his mind. "Sir," Robert said carefully, "I think you mean well. But you don't understand our situation. We're working people. We can't afford dreams above our station." Cross stood and walked to the forge, studying the quality of Robert's work. Half finished, horseshoes lined the workbench, each one shaped with the precision and care of a master craftsman. He picked up one of the shoes, testing its weight and examining the perfect curves of the metal. "Mr. Thompson," he said finally, "this is beautiful work, the kind of craftsmanship that takes years to develop and real intelligence to master." "Thank you," Robert replied, clearly puzzled by the direction of the conversation. "Tell me," Cross continued, "what do you think this town would do without a skilled blacksmith? What would happen to the mines without someone to shoe their horses and repair their equipment? I suppose they'd have to find someone else," Robert answered uncertainly. "Would they?" Cross asked. "How many men in Cedar Ridge have your skills? How many could step in tomorrow and do what you do?" Robert's shoulders straightened slightly as he began to understand Cross's point. "Not many, maybe none, at least not with my experience." "Exactly," Cross said with satisfaction. "You're not just some dispensable laborer, Mr. Thompson. You're an essential craftsman whose skills keep this entire community functioning. Your work has dignity and value, and so does your son's potential." Marcus was listening intently, his book still clutched in his lap, but his eyes bright with something that had been missing since that morning: hope. "But that doesn't change the fact that Mr. Whitman has expelled Marcus," Robert pointed out, "and there's nothing we can do about it." Cross smiled, and this time there was something almost predatory in his expression. "Mr. Thompson, what would you say if I told you that by tomorrow morning Mr. Whitman might find himself in need of a new position, and that a new educational opportunity might become available for Marcus and other children like him?" "I'd say you're talking nonsense," Robert replied, but his tone had lost some of its certainty. Cross walked to where his saddlebags hung over a wooden post and withdrew a leather portfolio. From it he extracted several official-looking documents and a thick stack of banknotes. "Mr. Thompson," he said quietly, "I'd like to make you an offer, not just for horseshoeing, but for something much more important. I'm going to need a partner in a new venture, someone I can trust to help me build something that matters, someone who understands the value of hard work and the importance of giving every child a chance to learn." Robert stared at the money in Cross's hands, more cash than he'd ever seen in one place. "Who are you?" he whispered. "My name is Samuel Cross," he replied, "and I'm someone who believes that every child deserves an education, regardless of whether their father's work leaves dirt under their fingernails." Marcus jumped up from his stool, his books scattering to the floor. "Are you really going to start a new school?" Cross looked down at the eager young face and saw himself 30 years ago, a poor boy who had been given a chance by someone who looked beyond his circumstances to his potential. "Marcus," he said solemnly, "I'm going to do something better than that. I'm going to make sure that no child in Cedar Ridge ever again has to choose between helping their family and getting an education. And I'm going to teach Mr. Whitman a lesson about the true meaning of standards." As the forge fire crackled behind them, casting dancing shadows on the walls, Robert Thompson began to believe that maybe, just maybe, his son's dreams weren't as impossible as he'd thought. Word spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire when Samuel Cross walked into the First National Bank of Cedar Ridge the next morning and requested a private meeting with the bank president, Jonathan Mills. What started as whispered speculation in the general store became outright astonishment when Cross emerged an hour later with Mills himself, both men heading directly toward the Whitman Mining Company offices. Marcus Thompson pressed his face against the window of his father's blacksmith shop, watching the unusual procession with growing excitement. His father stood beside him, still struggling to believe the previous day's conversation had actually happened. "He really meant it, didn't he, Pa?" Marcus whispered. Robert Thompson nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the well-dressed stranger who had promised to change their lives. "I believe he did, son, though I still don't understand how." They didn't have to wait long to find out. Within an hour, James Whitman himself emerged from his mining office, his face pale and his usually confident demeanor notably shaken. He was followed by his nephew Cornelius, whose pristine Boston suit now looked somehow less impressive in the harsh Colorado sunlight. Samuel Cross emerged last, and even from a distance, the Thompsons could see the satisfied expression on his weathered face. "Mr. Thompson," came a voice from behind them. Martha Hendricks stood in the doorway of the blacksmith shop, her arms full of supplies from her store. "I thought you might want to know what just happened over at the mining office." "You heard something?" Robert asked eagerly. Martha set down her packages and smiled broadly. "My husband was delivering supplies to the bank when Mr. Cross had his meeting with Jonathan Mills. Seems our mysterious stranger isn't quite as mysterious as we thought." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked. "Samuel Cross owns the second-largest mining operation in Colorado," Martha explained, her eyes twinkling with delight. He's worth more money than James Whitman ever dreamed of having, and he just made James an offer he couldn't refuse. Robert stared at her in disbelief. What kind of offer? The kind that involves buying out James Whitman's mining interests. And for enough money to set him up comfortably for life, Martha continued, but with one condition, that Cornelius Whitman's services as schoolmaster are immediately terminated. Marcus gasped. He bought the mine just to get Mr. Whitman fired. Not just fired, Martha said with obvious satisfaction. Completely removed from any position of authority over children's education, ever. As if summoned by their conversation, Samuel Cross himself appeared at the blacksmith shop doorway. Gone was the dusty, travel-worn appearance of the previous day. Though his clothes were still simple, there was now an unmistakable air of authority about him that made it clear he was accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Thompson, Marcus," he said with a genuine smile, "I hope you're both ready for some changes around here." "Is it true?" Marcus burst out. "Did you really buy Mr. Whitman's mine?" "I bought his mining interests, yes," Cross confirmed. "Though, I should clarify, I didn't buy them just to fire his nephew. I bought them because they were poorly managed and the workers were being mistreated. Cornelius Whitman's dismissal was simply an additional benefit." Robert Thompson shook his head in amazement. "But why? Why would you go to such lengths for people you barely know?" Cross's expression grew serious. "Because 30 years ago, I was a 12-year-old boy whose father worked in the coal mines of Pennsylvania. When my father was killed in a mine accident, I was told that education was wasted on boys like me, that my place was in the mines, following my father's path." Marcus's eyes widened. "What happened?" "A teacher named Miss Elizabeth Harper refused to accept that assessment," Cross continued. "She tutored me after school, helped me get into a boarding school on scholarship, and never let me believe that my circumstances defined my potential. Everything I've accomplished since then started with her refusal to accept that some children deserve less than others. And now you're doing the same thing for other children," Marcus said softly. "I try to," Cross replied. "Which brings me to why I'm here. Marcus, how would you feel about being the first student in Cedar Ridge's new community school?" "New school?" Robert asked. Cross nodded. "I've purchased the old church building at the end of Main Street. With some renovation, it will make an excellent schoolhouse. And I've already sent word to Denver for a teacher, a young woman named Miss Catherine Morrison, who believes, like Miss Harper did, that every child deserves an education regardless of their family's circumstances." Marcus was practically bouncing with excitement. "When will it open?" 2 weeks, Cross replied. "Miss Morrison arrives next Monday to begin preparations. The school will be free for all children, and there will be no dress codes or social requirements beyond basic respect and a willingness to learn." "What about the other children?" Marcus asked. "The ones who were in Mr. Whitman's class?" "They're all welcome, of course," Cross said, "though I suspect some of their parents may need time to adjust to the idea of their children learning alongside the sons and daughters of working families." Martha Hendricks laughed. "James Whitman's children? Learning next to the blacksmith's son? That should be interesting." "Actually," Cross said with a slight smile, "it might be the most valuable education any of them receive. They'll learn that intelligence and character aren't determined by bank accounts or family names." As the afternoon wore on, word of the new school spread throughout Cedar Ridge. Some families embraced the opportunity immediately, grateful for a chance at education for their children. Others, particularly those who had supported Cornelius Whitman's exclusionary policies, were less enthusiastic. But for Marcus Thompson, none of that mattered. That evening, as he sat at the kitchen table carefully copying out practice letters, in his best penmanship, he felt a joy he'd thought was lost forever. "Pa," he said, looking up from his slate, "do you think I can really become a teacher someday, like Mr. Cross's Miss Harper?" Robert Thompson looked at his son, this brave, intelligent boy who had never let circumstances dim his dreams, and felt his chest swell with pride. "Son," he said firmly, "I think you can become anything you set your mind to, and anyone who says different will have to answer to me." 3 weeks later, when Miss Catherine Morrison's community school opened its doors for the first time, 23 children filed into the converted church building. They came from mining families and merchant families, from the homes of craftsmen and the children of clerks. Some wore fine clothes, others wore patched hand-me-downs, but all carried the same thing: the bright anticipation of learning. Marcus Thompson sat in the front row, his slate clean and his pencil sharp, ready to begin the education that would eventually carry him to college, then to law school, and finally back to Cedar Ridge as the town's first mayor elected on a platform of equality and opportunity for all. And in the back of the classroom, Samuel Cross sat quietly for that first day of school, watching as Miss Morrison began her first lesson with a simple statement that would guide the school for decades to come. In this classroom, we measure success not by the fineness of your clothes or the wealth of your family, but by the brightness of your curiosity and the strength of your effort. Years later, when Marcus Thompson had become one of Colorado's most respected attorneys and a champion for workers' rights, he would tell his own children about the day a dusty stranger taught an entire town that true education begins not with judging who deserves to learn, but with recognizing that every child carries the potential to change the world. And in a dozen other frontier towns across the American West, similar schools would open, funded by Samuel Cross's quiet philanthropy and staffed by teachers who understood that the most important lesson they could teach was that worth is measured not by circumstances, but by character. The schoolmaster had indeed learned his lesson, that dignity cannot be bought or sold, and that the greatest education is learning to see the potential in every human soul, regardless of the dirt beneath their fingernails or the patches on their clothes.